to find the soul that's there and release it, so it'll fly, soar up to the top gallery.
He heard the whole conversation, heard me except and never said a word. I didn't think anything had happened, and then I got to rehearsal.
Some careers in Hollywood never got the chance to slow down. No decline, no quiet years, no graceful exit, just the work and then nothing. The stars on this list were at the absolute height of their powers when they were taken, leaving behind films that feel unfinished and careers that still haunt the imagination of anyone who thinks about what might have been. These are 10 old Hollywood stars who tragically died at their peaks. Number 10, Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard was the highest paid performer in Hollywood in 1937, higher than any male star, higher than any studio executive, and at the time of her death in January 1942, she was in the middle of a career that showed no signs of slowing down. She had just completed To Be or Not to Be with Jack Benny, directed by Ernst Lubitsch, which many critics consider the finest comedic performance of her career. She never saw it released. Born Jane Alice Peters in Fort Wayne, Indiana, on October 6, 1908, Lombard had been performing since childhood and signed her first film contract at 12 years old. A car accident in 1926 left a scar on her upper lip and briefly threatened to end her career. The studio system of the 1920s had a specific standard for the faces it was willing to photograph before she and her surgeons addressed it, and she continued working. She appeared in over 70 films between 1921 and 1942, a production pace that reflected both her commercial value and her own professional energy. Her comedic gifts were exceptional in the specific mode of 1930s screwball comedy, a genre that required physical timing, verbal speed, and an ability to commit completely to absurd situations without a single moment of self-consciousness. 20th Century in 1934 with John Barrymore, My Man Godfrey in 1936 opposite William Powell, Nothing Sacred in 1937, each of these films represents a peak that would have defined most careers, and Lombard produced all three within a 4-year stretch, while also managing her personal life with the same energy she brought to work. Her marriage to Clark Gable in March 1939 was one of the genuine partnerships in Hollywood history. Two people of equal force, equal professional standing, and apparent genuine affection for each other. She called him Pa. He called her Ma. They raised pigs together at their Encino ranch. She died on January 16, 1942, when the TWA transcontinental flight she was aboard, returning from a war bond tour in Indiana, crashed into Mount Potosi in Nevada, 30 miles southwest of Las Vegas. All 22 people on board were killed. She was 33 years old. President Roosevelt sent condolences to Gable personally. The grief that Gable carried from that point forward was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him, something he never resolved. Number 9, James Dean. James Dean made 3 films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, and of those 3, only the first had been released by the time he died. He was 24 years old. He had been a working actor in Hollywood for approximately 2 years at the level that mattered, and the career that those 3 films announced was one that the people who worked with him described as the most naturally gifted they had ever been near. Born James Byron Dean in Marion, Indiana, on February 8, 1931, he had grown up in Fairmount, Indiana, after his mother died of uterine cancer when he was 9, and his father sent him to live with his aunt and uncle. The abandonment, a surviving parent choosing to send a child away, shaped his adult relationships and his acting in ways that have been analyzed by every biographer who has approached him since. He arrived in New York in the early 1950s, studied at the Actors Studio, appeared in live television dramas that the medium was producing in considerable number at the time, and came to the attention of director Elia Kazan, who cast him as Cal Trask in East of Eden in 1955. The performance, raw, internally complicated, entirely committed, was unlike anything the studio system had produced in recent memory and earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Rebel Without a Cause was released in October 1955, 4 weeks after his death. Giant, in which he played the ambitious ranch hand Jet Rink across a film that spanned several decades, was released in November 1956, 14 months after he died, and earned him a second posthumous Academy Award nomination. He died on September 30th, 1955, on U.S. Route 466 near Cholame, California, when his Porsche 550 Spider collided head-on with a Ford Tudor driven by a student named Donald Turnipseed, who had not seen the smaller car approaching. The crash killed Dean instantly. He was 24 years old. The Academy Award nominations were both posthumous. The career they pointed toward is unknowable. Number 8. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old when she died in August 1962, and the question of whether she was at her peak or past, it depends entirely on which version of her story you are telling. The commercial version, the version measured in ticket sales and magazine covers, would suggest some decline. The creative version is entirely different. The Misfits in 1961, written by Arthur Miller specifically for her, gave her the most dramatically complete performance of her career, and the work she was doing on Something's Got to Give at the time of her death, seen in footage that survived from the production, showed a performer working at a level of precision and emotional access that the earlier comedies had not required of her. Born Norma Jean Mortensen in Los Angeles on June 1st, 1926, Monroe had spent her childhood moving through foster care and an orphanage after her mother's institutionalization, and arrived in Hollywood through modeling, a factory job during World War II, and the specific combination of physical gifts and personal magnetism that the camera responded to immediately, and that she spent the following 15 years learning to control. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953, How to Marry a Millionaire in 1953, The 7-Year Itch in 1955, Bus Stop in 1956, Some Like It, Hot in 1959. The commercial films that made her the most photographed woman in the world came in rapid succession through the 1950s. Her comedic gifts in Some Like It Hot were, by the testimony of director Billy Wilder and co-stars Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, produced under conditions of such sustained production difficulty that the achievement of the performance seems more remarkable the more you understand what it cost everyone involved to obtain it. She was fired from Something's Got to Give by 20th Century Fox in June 1962, a decision the studio reversed almost immediately when it became clear that replacing her was not as simple as they had assumed. Marilyn Monroe died on August 4, 1962, in Brentwood, California. The official cause was a probable overdose of barbiturates. The circumstances have been disputed for more than 60 years and are unlikely to be definitively resolved at this distance. She was 36 years old. Number 7. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift's death in July 1966 came after what most people who knew him described as a decade of slow self-destruction following a 1956 car accident that left his face permanently altered and accelerated an existing relationship with alcohol and prescription drugs to a pace that his body could not sustain indefinitely. Whether that constitutes dying at his peak depends on how you measure it. His most celebrated work, A Place in the Sun in 1951 and From Here to Eternity in 1953, came before the accident, but he was still working, still delivering performances of unusual depth, right to the end. Born Edward Montgomery Clift in Omaha, Nebraska on October 17, 1920, he had been identified as exceptionally talented on stage before he was 20. and his transition to film in the late 1940s produced work. Red River in 1948, The Search in 1948, A Place in the Sun in 1951, that received 4 Academy Award nominations across a 9-year period and established him as one of the defining actors of the post-war generation. His personal life was structured around concealment. His homosexuality, which the era made it professionally necessary to hide, and his dependency on alcohol and prescription drugs, which his studio managed with diminishing success. The car accident on May 12, 1956. He drove off Mulholland Drive after leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, left his jaw shattered and his face permanently altered. Taylor reportedly held him in the car and reached into his throat to remove broken teeth so he would not choke before the ambulance arrived. The decade after the accident was productive in spite of everything. Suddenly, last summer in 1959 with Taylor, The Misfits in 1961 alongside Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable, Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, for which he received his 4th Oscar nomination, and Freud, The Secret Passion in 1962. He was finishing post-production on The Defector when he died. Montgomery Clift died on July 23, 1966 in New York City at the age of 45 from occlusive coronary artery disease. He was found by his companion Lorenzo James. He had been sober for the final period of his life. Number 6. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was 26 years old and the most recognizable blonde in the world when she collapsed on the set of Saratoga in May 1937. The film was completed by a combination of her footage and a stand-in, released after her death, and became one of MGM's biggest commercial successes of that year. A macabre postscript to a career that had operated at full speed from its beginning and been stopped without warning. Born Harlean Harlow Carpenter in Kansas City, Missouri on March 3, 1911, Harlow had arrived in Hollywood as a teenager, married at 16, and begun working as a bit player before Hell's Angels in 1930. Howard Hughes's enormous aviation spectacle gave her the role that established her star persona overnight. The platinum blonde hair, the deliberately exaggerated sexuality, and the specific quality of comic warmth beneath the surface glamour, all of it arrived essentially complete in that first major role and remained consistent across the films that followed. Her MGM career through the early 1930s, Red Dust in 1932 with Clark Gable, Dinner at 8 in 1933, Bombshell in 1933, Reckless in 1935, demonstrated a range that her initial casting had not suggested. She was funnier than the sex symbol billing implied, warmer than the platinum blonde persona suggested, and capable of genuine dramatic work when the material supported it. Her personal life was marked by the sudden death of her husband, MGM producer Paul Byrne, on September 5, 1932, 2 months after their marriage, in a death ruled a suicide, but surrounded by rumors and speculation that MGM managed with the thoroughness the studio system applied to all threats to its commercial properties. She died on June 7, 1937, at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles from cerebral edema associated with kidney failure. She was 26 years old. Her mother, a Christian Scientist, had delayed medical treatment, a fact that has been discussed in every account of her death written since. Saratoga was released 6 weeks later. Number 5. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino's death in August 1926 produced one of the most extraordinary public responses in the history of celebrity, a reaction that prefigured the fan culture of the 20th century in ways that nobody had previously seen at that scale, and that the industry watched with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Born Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pier Philibert Guglielmi in Castellaneta, Italy, on May 6, 1895, Valentino had arrived in the United States in 1913 with limited English and no professional connections, and worked as a gardener, a dishwasher, a dance partner for wealthy women at New York social events, and a petty criminal at various points before finding his way to California and the film industry. He appeared as a bit player and villain in a series of films through the late 1910s, before director Rex Ingram cast him in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in 1921. The film was one of the highest-grossing silent productions ever made, and Valentino's performance, particularly the tango sequence, filmed with a smoldering physical precision that American audiences in 1921 had simply never seen from a male performer on screen, created a new category of screen presence that the industry did not have a prior framework for. The dark Latin lover, the sensual romantic hero, the man who conveyed desire without the awkwardness that most of his contemporaries brought to the same territory. All of it arrived essentially complete in that single sequence and remained consistent across the films that followed. The Sheik, the same year, generated both enormous commercial success and a specific cultural anxiety. Editorials were written about the effect that Valentino's screen persona might have on American women and on American masculinity more broadly. That reads now as a document of the period's discomfort with anything that challenged its categories. His second marriage, to actress and designer Natasha Rambova in 1922, was turbulent and publicly conducted, and his legal and professional difficulties through the mid-1920s included a bigamy charge stemming from a marriage that had not been legally finalized before the second ceremony. The Son of the Sheik in 1926, his final completed film, was one of his biggest commercial successes and was still drawing audiences in August 1926 when he collapsed in New York. He died on August 23, 1926, at Polyclinic Hospital in New York, at the age of 31, from pleuritis and septicemia following surgery for a perforated ulcer. The public response, women lining up outside the funeral home for blocks, crowds estimated in the hundreds of thousands following the funeral procession, suicides attributed to grief reported in multiple countries, established the template for a kind of celebrity mourning that has recurred at intervals across the century since. Number 4, Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood had been a star in Hollywood since she was 8 years old, had built one of the most decorated careers of her generation, and in 1981 was well into a body of work that included multiple Academy Award nominations when she drowned near Catalina Island under circumstances that have never been fully explained and that were formally reclassified as suspicious by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in 2012. Born Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko in San Francisco on July 20th, 1938, to Russian immigrant parents, she was performing on camera by the time she was 4. Her mother, Mud, as the family called her, recognized her daughter's qualities early and pursued opportunities for her with a determination that shaped the early years of Wood's life and career in ways she addressed with varying degrees of candor in interviews through the decades that followed. Miracle on 34th Street in 1947, in which she played the skeptical little girl who comes to believe in Santa Claus opposite Maureen O'Hara and Edmund Gwenn, is still the role that most people who know her name encounter first. Her transition from child star to adult actress was unusually successful by the standards of the industry. The vast majority of child performers who try to make that transition fail to sustain the adult career, and Wood managed it through a combination of genuine talent and an extraordinary run of significant projects in the early 1960s. Rebel Without a Cause, in 1955, alongside James Dean and Sal Mineo, earned her first Oscar nomination. Splendor in the Grass, in 1961, Elia Kazan's film about repressed desire in rural Kansas, earned her second. A performance of real emotional depth that required her to sustain scenes of breakdown and grief across an extended production schedule. West Side Story in 1961 and Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963 brought her third and fourth nominations, making her one of the most nominated performers of the decade. Her voice in West Side Story was dubbed by Marni Nixon, a fact that was not publicly disclosed at the time, and that Wood found deeply embarrassing when it eventually became known. Her marriages to Robert Wagner, first in 1957, divorce in 1962, remarriage in 1972, and the years between them, during which she had a long relationship with Warren Beatty, were followed closely by a press that found her personal life as commercially valuable as her professional one. She drowned on November 29, 1981, near Catalina Island, California. She was 43 years old. The circumstances remain disputed. The investigation was reopened in 2011 and reclassified as a suspicious drowning in 2012, following statements from witnesses whose accounts had not been fully examined in the original investigation. Number 3. Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant when she was murdered at her home on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles on August 9, 1969. She had just completed The Fearless Vampire Killers in 1967, directed by Roman Polanski, whom she married in January 1968, and Valley of the Dolls in 1967, and was at the beginning of a career that critics and directors who had worked with her described as genuinely promising. Born on January 24, 1943, in Dallas, Texas, to a military family that relocated regularly, her father, Richard Tate, was an Army intelligence officer. Tate spent her childhood moving between bases in Texas, Washington State, and Italy before the family settled in the United States, long enough for her to begin pursuing the modeling and acting work she had been interested in since her early teens. She appeared in Italian film productions while living in Verona, where her father was stationed, before returning to the United States and catching the attention of producer Martin Ransohoff, who signed her to a professional contract and introduced her to Hollywood systematically. Her early television work included appearances on The Beverly Hillbillies in 1963 and 1964, where she appeared in recurring roles that gave her on-camera experience before film roles began arriving. Eye of the Devil in 1966, a British supernatural thriller directed by J. Lee Thompson and starring David Niven and Deborah Kerr, was her first significant film appearance, and the reviews noted a composure and a naturalism that the early television work had not made as visible. Don't Make Waves in 1967, a comedy starring Tony Curtis, and The Wrecking Crew in 1968, a Dean Martin film, rounded out a filmography that was building in size and in the quality of the productions she was attached to. Valley of the Dolls in 1967 was her largest commercial exposure. The film itself was critically dismissed, but commercially significant, and it put her face in front of the largest audience she had yet reached. The reviews of her work in The Fearless Vampire Killers noted a lightness of comedic touch and a physical ease that suggested a performer who could have moved in several directions from that point. Polanski, who was not in the habit of directing performers without understanding what they were capable of, took her work seriously across the production. She was murdered by members of the Manson family, along with 4 others: Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. Charles Manson directed the killings without being present for them. Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel carried them out. The trial that followed dominated public consciousness through 1970 and 1971, and the murders permanently altered the cultural atmosphere of a decade that had been trying to sustain a more optimistic mythology about what the 1960s meant. The career Sharon Tate might have had is entirely unknowable. Number 2. River Phoenix. River Phoenix was 23 years old and had already received an Academy Award nomination, made several films that are still widely discussed, and built a reputation among directors and co-stars as one of the most naturally gifted actors of his generation when he died on a sidewalk outside a Los Angeles nightclub on Halloween night, 1993. Born River Jude Bottom in Madras, Oregon, on August 23, 1970, he was the eldest child of a family that had been members of the Children of God religious group and that traveled through Venezuela and Puerto Rico before settling in Florida and eventually California. He and his siblings, Rain, Joaquin, Liberty, and Summer, began performing to help support the family financially, working street corners and local events before television and then film work arrived. His talent was obvious enough from his earliest auditions that the transition from child actor to serious dramatic performer happened with a speed that the industry found unusual, even by the standards of the most gifted young performers it had seen. His early films, Explorers in 1985, The Mosquito Coast in 1986 alongside Harrison Ford, established him in the industry before Stand By Me in 1986 gave him the role that established him with audiences. Rob Reiner's adaptation of Stephen King's novella required a young ensemble to sustain a coming-of-age story with genuine emotional weight, and Phoenix's performance as Chris Chambers, the boy from the wrong family who can see his own limitations clearly and still tries to be better, was the emotional center of a film that needed exactly that quality. Running on Empty in 1988, directed by Sidney Lumet, cast him as a teenager whose 1960s radical parents have been living underground since bombing a napalm laboratory. The performance of a young man who wants a normal life that his family's choices have made impossible for him earned him the Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and the serious critical attention that followed him through the remaining 5 years of his career. My Own Private Idaho in 1991, Gus Van Sant's film, gave him the role most critics consider the definitive statement of what he was capable of. His talent was obvious enough from his earliest auditions that the transition from child actor to serious dramatic performer, a narcoleptic street hustler named Mike Waters who falls asleep at random, searches for a mother he cannot find, and loves his best friend with a completeness that the friend does not return. The film required Phoenix to be present in a way that most acting demands do not, and he met that demand with a performance that remains one of the genuinely irreplaceable things in American independent cinema. His brother Joaquin, who was with him outside the Viper room that night, called 911. The recording of that call has been described as one of the most distressing documents from the era. River Phoenix died on October the 31st, 1993, in West Hollywood, California, from acute multiple drug intoxication, a combination of cocaine and morphine. He was 23 years old. The films he would have made from that point are entirely unknowable. Number 1. Judy Garland. Judy Garland had been performing continuously for 40 years when she died in June 1969, which complicates the idea of dying at one's peak in her specific case. There were several peaks, each separated by periods of difficulty and recovery and return, and the question of which peak was the final one is not straightforward. But her last concert tour, which she completed in Europe in early 1969, produced reviews that describe performances of shattering emotional power, a voice that had changed from what it was in 1939, but that communicated something the earlier voice had not needed to communicate, and an audience connection that her entire career had been built toward. Born Frances Ethel Gum in Grand Rapids, Minnesota on June 10, 1922, Garland had been performing since she was 2 years old, had been pushed by her mother Ethel into vaudeville and then into a contract at MGM at 13, and had spent the first decade of her professional life managed by a studio that prescribed amphetamines to keep her thin and energetic and barbiturates to bring her down enough to sleep. The chemical dependency that marked her adult life was initiated before she was old enough to have consented to it. The Wizard of Oz in 1939, Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, A Star is Born in 1954, for which she gave a performance that many critics consider the greatest in the history of film musicals, and for which she lost the Academy Award to Grace Kelly in a decision that has been questioned consistently in the decades since, and Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, for which she received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress in a Dramatic Role, constitute the peak of a filmed career that operated simultaneously with a concert career of equal distinction. Her final recordings and her final performances in London, made in the months before her death, have a quality that is difficult to describe without sounding maudlin. The sound of someone who has processed a great deal and is performing with the specific authority of experience. Judy Garland died on June 22, 1969, in London at the age of 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose. She was found in the bathroom of the home she shared with her fifth husband, Mickey Deans, whom she had married 4 months earlier. Every name on this list represents a career that stopped in the middle of a sentence. Some were very young: Dean at 24, Phoenix at 23, Valentino at 31. Some were older but still fully in motion: Garland at 47, Monroe at 36, Clift at 45. What they share is the specific quality of absence. The films they didn't make, the performances they didn't give, the directions their careers would have taken if the timing had been different. The films they did leave behind are still here. The work survives even when the people who made it don't. If this kind of Hollywood history is what brings you here, hit that like button and subscribe. There is a lot more coming.